All right, let's go through this presentation on the background that you're going to need for the censors. So as you're reading the censors, this is a political short story, and we have to understand the politics and the background of Argentina to understand the story. So a very brief history. Argentina has been inhabited since 11,000 BC. That's a long time. There's been a lot of different indigenous people that have lived in Argentina and have thrived there before colonization, a lot like it was in the United States, well before the British, French, and Spanish colonized the U.S. There were native peoples, and before the Spanish colonized Argentina, there were a lot of indigenous peoples. Spanish colonization began in 1527. In 1536, Buenos Aires was established. The indigenous people were not very happy about the establishment of Buenos Aires, so they burnt the city down, and it was established again in 1580. Now, there are many viceroys who ruled Argentina while the monarchy in Spain thrived, and a viceroy was basically just a governor of the colony. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, the ideas of enlightenment spread throughout Europe, and this really impacted all of the colonies of the European powers, from the United States declaring its independence all the way through the Spanish king abdicating his throne in 1808. When the Spanish king abdicated his throne in 1808, that left a lot of instability in the colonies, and a lot of the colonies ended up starting to fight for independence. There was an overthrow of the viceroy in Argentina in 1810, and then a lot of years of civil unrest, 70 years to be exact, where people are fighting with each other to figure out who's going to be in power, how the country is going to be organized and settled. And it takes until 1880 for a relative calm to kind of settle in, which is pretty sad. 70 years of violence. Some of the motives for the government, and this is where a lot of that unrest came from, was this idea of, do you have a happy populace or do you have a group of really happy elites? And when we have a group of happy elite people, these are people who have the money. It's an oligarchy, basically. And when we have the conservative elites in power, there are really strong relationships with France and Britain. Argentina is able to become very wealthy, and there's a claim that democracy is being used, but democracy is not really being used. It's being used in name, but not really in practice. Because democracy is not being used in practice, the people who are the wealthy elites are able to barter and make some really good trade agreements, and that's what feeds Argentina's wealth. Then there's the end of the conservative elites running Argentina, and this happens in the early 1900s. And when this happens, President Roque Sáenz Peña, and I'm sure I mispronounced Sáenz, but when he becomes president in 1912, he enacts male suffrage. So all men within Argentina are able to vote. And this is followed up when President Riogan comes into power, and he has very socially liberal policies. Unfortunately, these policies are not very popular with the conservative elites, who still have a lot of strong backing in Europe. And they're able to overthrow Irigoyen in 1930s. So when Irigoyen is overthrown in 1930, the conservatives gain rule until 1946. And at this point, we should be very aware that there's a back and forth and a back and forth. So we have the conservative elites in power, then we have kind of a happy populace, then we go back to the conservative elites, and now we're about to hear about President Perón, who becomes president in 1946, and this is another example of the populace being in control. Like I said, Perón, he's an example of the populace being happy, so he is not an elite. He ensures that women can vote in 1947. His wife is very instrumental in that. Perón allows unions to thrive, and there's this idea of import substitution industrialization. Big terms, probably better if Miss Adams and Mr. Curley explain it to you. But to the best of my knowledge, what this really means is instead of importing goods, which keeps your your relationships with other countries strong when you're providing their economy with something, instead of importing a lot of goods, you are creating those goods within your own country. Because of this, the worth of the peso falls. The peso and Argentina are not as important to other countries. They don't have as good of relationships with other countries, and because of that, the worth of the peso falls apart, and a lot of the, what's a nice way of putting this? A lot of the respect, I guess, that the United States and other countries showed to Argentina starts to go away. This leads to a lot of paranoia within the Argentinian government, and so there's an amping up of censorship under Perón, and he goes into exile in 1955. Then there are many years of back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and in the early 1970s, Perón comes back with his second wife, and she's crazy, and he dies, and she's crazy, and in her craziness, she really upsets the government, or the army and the military, and there is a military coup in 1976, and the national reorganization process, which is the nice way of saying the new government and the new dictatorship, becomes very intense, which is a really nice way of saying or of describing how the government deals with opposing opinions. In essence, anybody who disagreed with the government was pretty much guaranteed to be imprisoned, tortured, and more than likely killed. The Dirty War refers to this period after 1976 until about 1981, when the government pretty much persecuted its own people at will. Anybody who disagreed with the national reorganization process and with the new government was treated very, very poorly. Anyone who was suspected was treated very poorly. Somewhere between 9,000 and 30,000 people disappeared in this time period, which is a disgusting number of people, and it's also a disgusting range of people. That means that there are 21,000 people that are unaccounted for. We don't know what happened. I can continue to attempt to explain this, but this video does a much better job of it than I can. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and let you watch through this video. You do need to keep your ears open. Make sure that you are listening carefully. I know that there's a language barrier where the accent is sometimes a little bit difficult to hear through. But please take your time and watch through this video. And be sure you take notes. This is important stuff for as you start to think about what you want to do your background presentation or do your blog entry, not your background presentation, but your blog entry on.
I was in Buenos Aires making a documentary called Are Disappeared, about people I knew who were kidnapped, tortured, and then killed during a right-wing military dictatorship 30 years ago. Every year, on the anniversary of the coup, thousands of people march along with the relatives and friends of the disappeared. Their presence is a reminder that the search for truth and justice must continue. But there are many in Argentina who want to forget the past. thinking that we must move on. But in order to heal, I think my country needs to more fully embrace the memory of the disappeared. They are our disappeared. Like in Germany after the Holocaust, children in Argentina need to grow up conscious of this dark chapter. This memorial ceremony was held at a school where my disappeared colleague Jorge Chinetti used to work.
Estamos aquí para que las nuevas generaciones conozcan el pasado, no para quedarse en él, sino para vivir la democracia presente y caminar hacia el futuro, con memoria, verdad y justicia.
Today, families still place remembrance ads in the newspaper to honor a disappeared relative. This remembrance ad was for Patricia Dixon, an old girlfriend from my university days. Patricia was almost surely taken to the ESMA, the Navy Mechanics School. The 4 huge columns have become the most visible symbol of the repression. Over 5,000 people were brought here to be tortured and then secretly detained for days, weeks, or months. Then they would be drugged and thrown alive from airplanes into the Rio de la Plata. The 4 columns now protect what is called the space for memory. For the thousands who drive by here every day, it is a vivid reminder of the terror that took over Argentina in 1976. These rare photographs were taken inside the Navy Mechanics School by a survivor who hid the negatives. They are the only known images of detainees. Photographer and human rights activist Marcelo Brodsky published them in a book called Memory Under Construction. One of these photographs is of his own brother.
Dentro de la representación he trabajado con la obra de muchos artistas, 65, son artistas de distintas generaciones que trabajan de alguna manera afectados por el mismo hecho, aportan un punto de vista diferente, original.
Many of the works of art in the book were exhibited on the 30th anniversary of the coup. One gruesome reminder was this dismembered Ford Falcon, the emblematic car used to cart away suspects in the middle of the night. The coffee cup is Navy issue, morbidly transformed. The caption under this image of the Rio de la Plata, created by Marcelo Brodsky, reads, "They threw them into the river. It became their non-existent tomb." But art exhibits close. Public memorials remain. A memory park is slowly being built overlooking the river where so many disappeared. But the park's location is out of the way, easy to avoid. Funding is uncertain, subject to political vagaries. And more recently, a stone wall was built with all the names engraved. The most striking sculpture in the park is in memory of 3 of Rafa Belaustegui's children, all of whom were taken along with their spouses. I visited it with Rafa and with his grandson Antonio, whose father is represented by one of the figures.
A mí esta obra de entrada me impactó mucho, ¿no? Bueno, sabía que era la representación de mis hijos.
Son como unos cuerpos, pero al mismo tiempo están vacíos.
Claro. Eso transmite la idea de desaparición, desde ya.
Claro.
Queda el perfil nomás.
Y bueno, y además puesta en este lugar, el río de fondo, que es lo que sirvió de sepulcro.
For Argentina, the task of remembering is hard work. But the thousands of disappeared souls deserve no less. Each demonstration, each work of art, each poem or film is another pebble thrown into the water that reminds the country of what our disappeared stood for, and how cruelly the military disposed of them.